She stood in the hallway, still wearing her maid's apron, while the other staff whispered that she didn't belong there. Not in that room. Not at his bedside. But his hand was the one holding hers, weak, shaking, refusing to let go. Please, just stay. One night. I don't want to face the dark alone. They stared at her like she was nothing, like she was dirt on polished marble, like she had no right to be the person he asked for in his final hours. And if you're watching this right now, take a second. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who's here with us tonight. And, before we go deeper, subscribe, not for numbers, but because the next chapters will hit places in you that you haven't touched in a long time, and you don't want to miss what happens after this moment. Now, let's go back to where it began. He wasn't always this fragile, and she wasn't always invisible. The mansion was always quiet in the mornings, not peaceful, just quiet in the way large, cold places are when they are filled with things instead of people. Marble floors, long corridors, windows taller than most houses. Yet hardly any laughter had ever touched the walls. Leora learned to move through it without sound. Her shoes didn't echo. Her breathing stayed small. She carried fresh linens from room to room as the sun slid across the floors in pale gold stripes. The other staff worked quickly, always looking over their shoulders. The house didn't allow mistakes, not because anyone shouted, but because the silence itself felt like judgment. Leora kept her eyes lowered most days. It was easier to be unseen. Being seen often led to trouble. She filled vases in the west hallway with fresh white lilies. The flowers weren't hers. Nothing here was hers. But she liked how the petals opened slowly in the morning light, like something gentle refused to die in a place that tried to smother softness. The head housekeeper walked past her without stopping. Just a glance, a reminder. Leora nodded slightly and kept arranging the stems until they sat just right. She had been working here for 8 months, long enough to learn the rules, long enough to understand what people whispered about the man who owned all of this. His name traveled in rooms like a quiet warning. Cassian Vale. Powerful, brilliant, untouchable. The world outside adored him. The staff inside did not speak his name unless needed. He lived mostly behind closed doors, meetings at strange hours, private calls, doctors who came through the side entrance, leaving no record of visits. The staff pretended not to notice. They were not paid to notice. Cut to late afternoon. The sky was gray and heavy with the smell of rain. Leora was polishing the silver trays in the dining room when the butler entered, stiff-backed as always. Leora, he requested tea, prepared by you, and brought upstairs. The cloth stopped in her hands. She did not look up right away. No one requested her, not by name. The other staff looked at her from the doorway, not curious, guarded, as if this single message could change something in the air. She washed her hands twice before she made the tray. Black tea, lightly sweetened, a thin slice of lemon, porcelain cup without a saucer. She remembered these details. They were small, but they mattered. She carried the tray through the long corridor and up the central staircase. Her heart felt too loud in her chest. At the top of the stairs, a door stood open. Soft light spilled out. She stepped inside. Cassian Vale was seated in a chair near the window, staring out at the approaching storm. His posture was straight, but his hands trembled slightly when he rested them in his lap. He turned his head. His eyes found hers. Not the way people look at staff, the way people look when they have been waiting for someone. "Set it here," he said quietly. She did. His gaze lingered. He already looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. She stepped back once the cup was in place, not too fast, not too slow, the way she had been taught. The rain had begun. Soft at first, a distant tapping on the window glass. Cassian watched it as though it were delivering news only he could understand. "Sit," he said. Leora hesitated. There were no chairs for staff to use here. She looked toward a small bench near the bookshelf. He nodded once, confirming that was what he meant. She sat, hands folded in her lap, eyes down. The silence settled again, but it was not the same kind of silence that filled the rest of the house. This one had weight, like something was about to be said that could not be undone afterward. Cassian lifted the teacup. His hand shook again, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice. But Leora noticed everything. He took a sip, breathed out, and rested the cup on the silver tray. "You have been here 8 months," he said. She nodded. "You work quietly." She nodded again. "You do your job without seeking attention." She did not know if that was praise or observation or warning, so she said nothing. Another long pause, the kind that made the sound of the rain seem louder. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. Leora kept her eyes lowered, the appropriate posture, the safe posture. He was quiet a moment. "I am dying." The words did not echo. They settled, heavy like wet fabric. Leora did not flinch, not because it did not affect her, but because she had learned long ago that reacting to the pain of others was not always welcome. He looked down at his hands as if they were no longer familiar to him. "It is not public," he added. "No one here knows. Not even the staff who think they understand everything." Leora slowly lifted her eyes. For the first time since she entered the room, she looked at his face directly. Not at the reputation, not at the wealth, just at the man. He looked tired in a very human way, not powerful, not feared, just lonely. The rain hit harder, trailing streaks across the glass. He breathed in once, sharply, as though holding something fragile inside his chest. "I do not want to die alone." Leora didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply breathed, steady and quiet, the way one does when the world suddenly tilts but you have no place to fall. Cassian's gaze didn't demand pity. It didn't seek comfort. It was the look of someone who had already accepted the ending and was only now deciding how to face it. He lowered his eyes, as though the floor might be easier to confess to than another living person. "I have seen people come and go," he said, voice low. "Advisors, investors, lawyers, women who smiled for the cameras, every one of them took something, or wanted something, and when there was nothing left to take." His jaw tightened. They disappeared. The wind pushed against the windows, rattling them softly. Leora kept her hand still, even though her fingers wanted to tremble. "You," he continued, "have never taken anything from me." It was not flattery, it was observation. Plain, true, the kind of truth that does not require reply. He let the silence breathe between them for a long moment, then quietly, without command, "Will you stay tonight?" The words hung there. Not dramatic, not heavy, just real. Leora blinked once. She understood the question, and everything it meant, not romance, not seduction, not ownership, not desire, just presence. A warm room instead of a silent one. A heartbeat near another heartbeat. A human refusing to let another human face the dark alone. She opened her mouth slightly. A hint of breath, but no sound came yet. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. The butler appeared in the doorway, stopping when he saw them. His eyes flicked to Cassian, then to Leora, and the judgment in them was not subtle, as though her being here was wrong, as though the room itself rejected her existence. Cassian didn't turn, didn't look, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Leave us." The butler hesitated, just long enough to show the insult. Cassian spoke again, only 2 words. "Now, please." The butler disappeared. Silence returned, softer this time, like it belonged there. Cassian leaned back in his chair, his breathing slow and uneven. The storm outside was growing stronger. Leora sat perfectly still. She hadn't answered, but she hadn't left. Cassian's breathing settled into a rhythm, slow enough to match the rain. Leora watched his fingers rest against the arm of the chair, the slightest tremor running beneath the skin. He had always looked carved from something unbreakable. Seeing him like this felt like watching a monument soften. The storm deepened. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, not loud yet, just a warning of what was coming. Leora stood, quietly, not to leave, just to move. She lifted the empty teacup and tray and carried them back down to the kitchen. The staff watched her return with the same whispering eyes as before. He washed the cup slowly, the warm water rising past her wrists. She dried it, placed it in its place, then paused. For the first time since taking this job, she didn't know what came next. There was no routine for this, no training. She went back upstairs. He was still there, not asleep, just waiting. She stepped inside fully, closing the door behind her. The latch clicked softly. A private sound. Cassian's eyes lifted. "You came back." She nodded. That was all. He motioned toward the armchair beside his, a chair that no one used. She sat, careful, poised, hands resting lightly on her knees. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The room held everything, the sound of the storm, the faint ticking of a clock, the quiet rise and fall of two breaths that didn't match but didn't clash. Time passed in a way that didn't feel like passing at all. At one point Cassian's eyes closed, not fully asleep, just resting, the kind of rest someone allows only when they feel safe enough. Leora didn't look away from him. She didn't allow her mind to wander. She stayed exactly in that moment, completely, without thinking of herself. The lightning flashed, not harsh, just enough to illuminate the outline of his profile, sharp, elegant, impossibly tired. When he opened his eyes again, it was slow, careful, as though every movement cost something. He turned his head, not fully, just enough to meet her gaze. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, soft, honest, worn. Leora nodded once. She did not know him, not really. Not the man the world praised, not the man whose name was spoken like currency, but right now she knew enough. He did not want to be alone, and she understood that more deeply than she had ever spoken aloud. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. He leaned his head back. "I'll tell you why I asked for you," he murmured. The room held its breath. His breathing slowed for a moment, as if gathering the strength to shape the next words. But instead of explaining, he simply looked toward the window again. The rain traced long, uneven paths down the glass. The sky had darkened, folding the house into a quiet that felt almost sacred. There was no rush. He spoke when he could. "You remind me of something I lost," he said, voice low, almost distant. "A long time ago." Leora didn't ask what. She didn't break the silence. She let the words settle into the room the way rain settled into soil, slow, steady, letting meaning find its own shape. He exhaled through his nose softly, the kind of exhale someone makes when remembering hurts, even if the memory is gentle. "Most people who stand in front of me want to take," he continued. "Your presence doesn't demand. It doesn't reach. It just exists. Quietly." The clock on the wall ticked once, then again. "It has been a very long time since I have felt quiet," he said. Lightning flickered, a pale flash behind the window, making both of their shadows stretch across the floorboards. Leora's hands rested still in her lap. Her pulse had softened, evened out. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Silence was not empty here. It was understood. Cassian leaned his head back slightly, closing his eyes again. The lines on his face deepened, not with age, but with weight. Years of exhaustion that no sleep had ever eased. The storm moved closer. The room darkened. Leora stood slowly, moved to the lamp near the window, and switched it on. A warm, golden light filled the space, softening the hard corners of the room. Cassian's eyes opened at the light. He did not speak, but there was a shift, small, almost invisible, something like relief. Leora returned to her seat. Minutes passed, maybe many, maybe few. Time was not measured in this room anymore. It moved the way breathing did, naturally, without needing to be watched. Then Cassian spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Tonight will be difficult. Not dramatic, not fearful, just true." He looked at her, really looked, and there was no distance in his gaze now, no wall, no veneer, just a very human plea from someone who had spent his life being anything but human. "Don't leave," he said. A soft thunder rolled, closer now. The house shuddered faintly. Leora's voice finally came, quiet, steady, almost fragile but real. "I won't." The room did not shift. The storm did not pause. Nothing changed outwardly, but something inside the space between them moved, something that could not be named but could be felt. Cassian's shoulders eased, not fully, but enough to show that her answer mattered. He nodded once, like a promise had been made. The storm deepened through the night. Rain hammered against the windows, steady and unbroken, like a rhythm the house was forced to breathe with. Shadows moved along the walls, long and slow, stretching and shrinking with each flicker of lightning. Leora remained seated beside Cassian. Neither of them spoke. There was no need to explain anything. The room had already taken its shape around their silence. Cassian's breaths were uneven, not painful, just tired. The exhaustion of a man who had carried too much, for too long, alone. At some point the clock chimed. A late hour. Leora didn't count. She simply listened. Cassian shifted slightly, as if something inside him had tightened. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when people filled this house." His voice wasn't telling a story. It was remembering aloud. Parties, gatherings, laughter that didn't belong to me. I watched them from the staircase. They celebrated what they thought I was. A legend, a force to be admired, but none of them knew me. Not one. A pause. Only the rain answered. "When I finally realized that," he continued, "I closed the doors, let them all stay outside." Leora listened. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened. "People talk to me," he murmured. "They tell me things. They expect me to fix their world. But none of them ever ask if mine is broken." His hands rested over one another on the arm of the chair. They looked strong, but the skin was thinner now, stretched over tendons and bone. Lightning washed the room in pale white. For a second, everything looked ghost-like. Leora's voice was quiet when it finally came. "You closed the doors, because staying open hurts." Cassian turned his head toward her. Slowly. There was no surprise in his expression, just recognition. "Yes." The word landed softly. "True." Leora looked down at her hands. They were not elegant hands, not polished, but steady. "I understand," she said. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just truth meeting truth. Cassian watched her for a moment longer, as though seeing her in a new way, not as someone small or replaceable or passing through his world, but as someone who had always understood a language he never spoke aloud. His voice dropped lower. "I asked for you tonight because you do not fill the room with noise." The rain continued. The light stayed warm. The night held its shape around them. Leora folded her hands again, quiet and certain. Silence returned, but this silence was not empty anymore. It was shared. Cassian leaned his head back. His eyes closed again. This time, not from exhaustion, from trust. The golden lamplight softened as the storm outside shifted from hard rain to a steady, endless pour. The sound filled the room like a blanket, a quiet shield from everything beyond those walls. Cassian's breathing steadied for a long moment, then faltered again. Not sharply, just enough that Leora noticed the strain behind it. She didn't speak. She didn't rise. She simply shifted her chair closer, inch by inch, until the space between them disappeared into warmth instead of distance. He didn't open his eyes, but he felt it. The presence, the closeness, the choice. "You're not afraid of me," he murmured. It wasn't a question. Leora watched the way his eyelashes rested against his skin, the way his hand twitched faintly, like it remembered strength but could no longer hold it. "No," she said. A simple answer. Nothing added, nothing taken away. Cassian's lips moved with the hint of something that might have once been a smile. Small, tired, almost invisible. For a while, neither of them spoke. The house existed around them, just two breaths in a mansion too large for anyone's heart. Then, slowly, Cassian lifted his hand, just slightly, as though reaching for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask for. Leora saw the movement, not dramatic, not pleading, just quiet. She placed her hand over his, their skin touched, not for comfort, not for duty, not for gratitude, but because no one should touch death alone. Cassian exhaled, not a sigh, more like a release. Something inside him loosened. He opened his eyes again, not fully, just enough to see her. "There was a girl," he said, voice close to a whisper now. "Years ago." The world outside continued moving, rain, wind, time, but inside the room, everything focused on his words. "She sat with me in a hospital hallway," he continued, "when I thought there was nothing left. She didn't speak. She didn't ask who I was. She just sat beside me." Leora didn't breathe. He swallowed, the memory thick in his throat. "She handed me a cup of tea, and in that moment, I didn't feel alone." Lightning illuminated the room for a heartbeat, one silent second of pure clarity. Cassian's hand tightened faintly around hers. "When I saw you here," he said, "I knew." Leora's voice did not come, not because she didn't understand, but because she did, too deeply. The room held the truth now, even if he hadn't spoken it plainly. Cassian looked at her hand in his. "You saved me once," he said softly, "before you ever knew my name." Thunder rolled again, closer, louder, fuller. Leora's eyes didn't leave his. She had been kind once, without meaning to, without knowing who she touched, without ever expecting anything to return. And now she was here, not by accident, not by chance, but because something in the world remembered. Cassian's voice broke slightly. "Stay with me tonight." Leora's answer was a breath. "I'm here." And the night continued, not ending, not rushing, just unfolding, slow and sacred, one heartbeat at a time. The night deepened, and the storm crawled across the sky like a heavy animal. The mansion seemed smaller now, the world pressed close around the single room where two people sat quietly, sharing the same air. Cassian's eyes drifted closed again, not in sleep, but in the way someone closes a door gently to keep the warmth inside. Leora adjusted her hand so his could rest more comfortably, her touch steady and unhurried. The clock ticked. Rain whispered. Breath against breath. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost its shape here. Cassian opened his eyes once more, slower this time. "There is something I fear," he said. His voice was rough, not from emotion, but from the simple exhaustion of being alive. Leora didn't change her expression. She didn't lean in. She didn't brace herself. She simply waited, the same way she had waited her entire life, quietly, patiently, open. Cassian looked toward the window again, but his gaze wasn't on the storm. It was somewhere far away. "To die," he said, "is not what frightens me." The words were not dramatic. They were almost conversational, the way someone speaks of the weather or the day ending. "What frightens me," he continued, "is that I built a life so large, and no one will remember me as anything more than what I owned." He paused. "That no one ever actually knew me." The wind sighed against the house. The lamp hummed softly. Leora's thumb brushed once across the back of his hand, a movement so small it could have been imagined. "You're being known now," she said quietly. Cassian's chest rose and fell once, slowly. The truth of her words did not need explanation, Not the world knowing him. Not crowds. Not headlines. Just one person sitting close enough to hear him breathe. That was enough. He shifted slightly in his chair, the movement careful, almost fragile. "You should rest," Leora said. He shook his head once. "If I sleep, I may not wake," he murmured. She didn't argue. He lifted his other hand, weak, trembling, but intentional, and let it hover in the space between them. Leora met it, taking it with the same care one would offer something breakable. Their hands intertwined. Nothing dramatic, no music, no declarations, just two humans holding on to the only moment they had. The storm rolled closer, thunder now blooming across the sky. Cassian's breathing grew uneven again, and Leora shifted, leaning just slightly toward him, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't fill the silence. She stayed. Cassian's voice came next, barely audible. "If there is something after this, I hope it is quiet." Leora nodded once. He closed his eyes, still holding her hands. The rain softened. The room rested with them. The night carried on. The storm outside eased into a soft, steady fall, like the sky itself was tired. The house, which always felt too large, too cold, seemed to breathe slower now, matching the rhythm of the two figures in the lamplight. Cassian's head tilted slightly toward Leora, as though her presence was something his body leaned into without thought. Leora didn't move away. She allowed closeness. She allowed warmth. She allowed the moment to be what it was. His voice came again, faint enough that she had to listen with more than her ears. "There was a time when I believed I didn't need anyone." The words were not regret, not pride, statement, nothing more. Leora's fingers remained steady around his. The lamplight flickered once. "I built everything," Cassian said, "from nothing, not because I wanted wealth, but because I did not want to be small again." His breathing paused, continued, each inhale a quiet labor. "When people realize you can survive alone," he whispered, "they stop offering to stay." Leora blinked slowly. Her voice was a thread, soft, sure. "I stayed." Cassian's lips moved with the ghost of something warm, not a smile, something older than a smile. "Yes," he breathed, "you did." The clock ticked. The rain sighed. The night listened. Leora adjusted her posture just enough to support him when his shoulders sagged. The movement was instinct, gentle and seamless. She did not think about it. She simply did it. Cassian leaned into her, letting gravity do what pride never had. His head rested lightly against her shoulder. The contact was quiet, tender, human. Leora didn't tense. She didn't freeze. She allowed him to exist without needing to be anything else. His voice, now just above a whisper, "You remind me what it feels like to just be a man." Leora's eyes softened, though her face remained calm. "You always were," she said, not reassurance. Truth. Cassian's breath trembled, not from pain, from something deeper. Lightning flickered softly in the distance, but the storm no longer felt threatening. It felt like a curtain being drawn around the world, letting only this room remain. Leora's hand lifted, slow and careful, and rested on the side of his arm. No urgency, no pity, just presence. Cassian exhaled again, his body releasing tension he had worn for years. He spoke one more time, and the words were so soft they almost dissolved into the air. "Don't go," Leora answered without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere. No oath, no vow, no performance, just truth. The kind that doesn't need to be repeated to be believed." The night held them like that, quiet, breathing, alive, until the first pale trace of dawn began to touch the edge of the sky. The pale light of early morning crept slowly across the sky, faint and colorless. It didn't break the night, it only thinned it. The rain had quieted to a soft mist tapping against the glass, steady and gentle, like a quiet reminder that time was still moving. Cassian's breathing had grown lighter, more fragile. Each inhale came with effort, each exhale with release. Leora kept her hand on his, steady as the ticking clock on the wall. No fear, no panic, only presence. The room held the stillness of a church. Cassian opened his eyes again. Not wide, just enough. His gaze was unfocused at first, then found her slowly, as if recognizing something familiar through water. "You're still here," he murmured. It wasn't a question. Leora nodded once. Cassian's chest rose with a faint breath that sounded almost like relief. He tried to straighten slightly, but his body had given up the strength to follow him. Leora adjusted her posture, shifting to support him without drawing attention to the act. The gesture was seamless, natural, the kind of care that didn't ask for acknowledgement. His head rested lightly against her shoulder again, as if it belonged there. The dawn light caught on the strands of his hair, softening him further. He looked less like the man who owned empires, and more like someone who had simply reached the end of his long journey. His voice came slowly, shaped with intention. "Most of my life." He paused, gathering breath. "I spoke, and rooms listened. Rain whispered against the glass. But no one ever heard me." Leora's fingers tightened around his just slightly. A quiet reply made without sound. Cassian swallowed, the motion small and difficult. "Last night, you heard me." Leora didn't speak. She didn't need to. Silence had been the language between them long before words were ever used. He closed his eyes again. His breathing grew shallow, light, uneven, almost weightless. Outside the window, the clouds began to break, just enough to let a thin ribbon of morning light touch the floorboards. Cassian's voice came again, softer than any moment before. "If this is the last morning I see..." His breath caught. "I'm glad it's with someone who stayed." Leora's eyes lowered, her expression still calm, but her breath deepened, as though emotions moved beneath the surface like deep water. She spoke only 2 words. "I'm here." Cassian's fingers curled faintly around hers in acknowledgement, a final gesture that was not desperate, not clinging, but grateful. His breathing slowed. The rain continued. The first light of day settled quietly into the room, and the world outside did not yet know that everything had changed. The light grew a little stronger, enough to draw faint shadows across the floor. It wasn't bright. It was the kind of morning that slips in gently, as if not to disturb anyone who is resting. Cassian's eyes stayed closed, but he was still awake. Leora could tell by the way his fingertips moved, small, slow, alive. She kept her hand around his, matching the shape of his grip, so he didn't have to hold anything alone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The house began its morning routine below them. Quiet footsteps, doors opening, metal against porcelain in the kitchen. Life continued as if nothing had shifted upstairs. But the room they were in felt separate, held apart from the rest of the world. Cassian's voice came again, faint now, almost blended with the sound of the rain. "I used to think strength meant never leaning on anyone." A pause, a breath that trembled, not from pain but from memory. "It took me my whole life to learn that strength is knowing when to let someone hold you." Leora's eyes lowered, not in shame, in understanding. "I don't mind holding you," she said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of truth that needed no decoration. Cassian's lips parted just slightly, as though he wanted to respond, but instead a quiet breath escaped him, light as morning fog. Leora adjusted her free hand and wiped a bit of moisture from his brow. Slow, careful, gentle, the kind of gesture given to someone without expecting anything in return. He breathed out again. This time it was slower. His hand loosened a fraction, though it did not let go. Leora leaned closer, her voice soft enough to barely disturb the air. "Rest," she whispered. "I'll be here when you wake." His breathing steadied, not strong, but steady, like a rhythm finding peace. The storm had passed now. Only a faint drizzle remained. The world was quiet. Cassian's head rested against her shoulder fully, the last of his tension easing from him like a long exhale finally released. The light reached the window ledge. The room warmed by a small amount. The house continued to move below, unaware. Leora didn't move, didn't shift, didn't close her eyes. She sat with him, holding his hand as the morning settled into day, keeping her promise without speaking it again, just 2 breaths, one growing lighter, one steady, anchoring both. The world outside woke slowly, and in that room time behaved differently, soft, patient, unhurried, because no one in that moment dared to break it. The day unfolded quietly, the clouds thinned to a pale gray, and the rain faded into nothing but damp air clinging to the windows. The world outside began to move in its usual rhythm, cars on the distant road, birds returning to morning branches, the staff downstairs preparing breakfast with the same practiced motions. None of that touched this room. Cassian's breaths grew lighter, each one a little slower than the last, not dramatic, not sudden, life leaving gently, the way a candle burns down to its final ember. Leora did not speak. She did not shift. Her hand stayed in his, her posture steady, her presence constant. There was nothing to fix, nothing to stop, only something to accompany. Cassian stirred once, his fingers curling weakly around hers. His voice was almost air now. Leora. She leaned slightly closer so he wouldn't need to force his breath. His eyes opened just enough to see her, not the room, not the world, just her. You were the only moment of peace I ever had. Not poetic, not dramatic, just true. Leora's thumb brushed along the back of his hand, slow and steady. You have peace now, she said softly. His gaze didn't waver, but his body loosened, easing into her hold like he was finally allowed to rest. A faint breath escaped him. Not pain, relief. The kind of release that comes from finally setting something down after carrying it for years. His hand remained in hers, but it no longer held. The clock ticked once. The room settled into silence. Leora didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't call for anyone. She simply held him the same way she had held the night, without fear, without demand, without leaving. The light continued spreading quietly across the floor, and Cassian Vale, the man the world believed was carved from stone, rested at last. Leora sat with him for a long time, her hand still wrapped around his, the dawn slowly unfolding around them. No one else knew yet. No one had heard. No one outside this room had witnessed the final moment of his life. But he hadn't been alone. He hadn't faced the dark in silence. Someone stayed, and the world outside kept moving, unaware that something gentle had just ended and something sacred had just begun. The house came alive only when the door opened and the butler stepped inside. He froze, seeing them there. Cassian, still. Leora, seated beside him, holding his hand. No panic, no shock, just a quiet understanding settling into the room like dust on sunlight. Leora did not look up. She didn't need to. Words spread through the mansion without voices. A hush, a shift in air. Someone closed curtains downstairs. Someone lit a hallway candle. Someone else stood still for a long time. They all knew, but none of them entered. It wasn't their moment to interrupt. Leora stayed until the light filled the room in full. Only then did she gently lay Cassian's hand across his chest, smoothing the fabric of his sleeve. Her movements held no ceremony and no hurry, only respect. She stood slowly. Her legs ached from sitting so long, but she didn't notice. Her body was here, her attention was still with him. She looked at him one last time, not as the world knew him, not as the legend, the empire, the untouchable name, just as a man who did not want to die alone. She touched the side of his chair, softly, like saying goodbye without using words. Then she stepped back, opened the door, and walked down the hall. No one stopped her. No one whispered now. They made space. In the kitchen, the morning sun hit the sink where she had washed his cup the night before. She paused there, not to cry, just to breathe. Her life was the same as it had been yesterday, simple, quiet, unremarked, and yet something inside her had shifted in a way the world would never notice, but time would never undo. She walked to the back entrance, the one the staff used. She stepped out into the cool morning. The air smelled like wet stone and the tail end of rain. She didn't look back. Not because there was nothing there for her, but because what needed to be carried was already with her. A single kindness given years ago, a single night given now, a life touched in 2 moments that changed everything. Some stories do not end with grand gestures. Some end quietly, soft enough to be missed by the world, but not by the heart that lived them. And as Leora walked forward, the sun began to break through the clouds, thin, gentle, quiet light, like the world was opening again, slowly, patiently, just as she was.